Більшості сьогодні буде в англійській мові. Ранішня сесія та перша. Бо то є оповідання і тяжко перескакувати з одної мови до другої. Мова буде легка, англійська не буде там тих дуже серйозних слів. I just mentioned that this talk, because it's a story, it's a true story, but it's a story, it's very difficult to switch languages in the middle. So I'll say it in English using hopefully simple English that everyone will be able to understand. If there are language issues, I will come back to me at the end and I will be able to explain or highlight for you those parts that you may have missed, or sit beside someone who is able to translate for you. Якщо маєте проблему з англійською мовою, пишайте при кому, що може вам слово пояснити, якщо щось не зрозуміли. This story happened in 1985. I was a chaplain at Children's Hospital while doing my studies at St. Paul's University. As I mentioned yesterday, I was a crisis chaplain. I dealt mostly with children who are dying or underwent a major trauma in their life that would be life-altering. I did not have hours. Від тої до тої години має бути в лікарні. Whenever they needed me, they would call me. And we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have cell phones then. But they had a very cruel machine called a pager. Some of the older gentlemen here will remember those days. It's a little machine that went on your belt, and they would phone the telephone number, and they would go beep, 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 beep. You would look on the screen, and it would tell you either the number or the message that you had to get. I lived with that pager 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 50 weeks of the year. Every time the pager went off, I knew something bad happened or will happen. This was February. 2:00 in the morning. I was sleeping. Beep, 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 beep. I looked at the screen. It was the emergency room at the Children's Hospital. I phoned them, and they said, "Come on in. There's been a bad accident." So I jumped in the car, drove to the hospital. The nurses took me. They had rooms set aside for families that they could wait in private, especially in really bad cases. And the nurses directed me to the room. All they said was a girl got hit by a car. That's all they said. And in that room were a father and a mother. And that we introduced ourselves. I asked what happened, and they said their daughter was in an accident. A car hit her. And they started to explain to me who their daughter was. Her name is Julia. And she was their only child. No more children. And their daughter was exceptional. Top student, nadzwyczajna, wyjątkowa. Top student in the class. Everybody loved her. She helped around the house. She helped her friends. She loved sport. And she specialized, specjalizowała się w gymnastics. And her best event was the floor exercise, where they tumble and jump and somersault. She was 13 years old at the time this happened. She went to church. She prayed. A perfect child. She, as far as her athletic ability, she was Canada's best hope for a medal at the upcoming Olympics. The Olympics were 3 years away, I believe. That night, she finished her training. She trained 3 nights a week and Saturdays. That night, she finished her training and she was waiting at a bus stop. In Ottawa, they have enclosed bus stops with glass so you stay out of the wind. She was waiting at the bus stop when a drunk driver came. He lost control of the car. He smashed through the bus stop and he hit Julie. When I came, the parents were still waiting to hear from the doctors how bad it was. And I sat with them and we waited. In a short time, 2 doctors walked in. And usually, when the doctors walk in, I stand up, I walk out to give them privacy. And as I was standing up, one of the doctors put his hand on my shoulder, sat me down. And they spoke to the parents and they said, "We have good news. We have bad news. The good news is that your daughter did not die. We saved her life. The bad news is the way the car hit her snapped the spinal column above the waist. And your daughter will be paralyzed from the waist down." As the doctors were speaking, I was looking at the faces. There was both relief and fear. They were happy that their daughter was alive, but they could not imagine their daughter in the wheelchair for the rest of her life. Whenever I met a family, I stayed with the family until either the patient got relieved, got checked out from the hospital, or the patient died and the family went on. So I stayed with Julie. Julie was in the ICU, intensive care. Це є по-українськи ICU лікарня. Дякую. And she was there for 3 days. They kept her in a coma to help her body adjust. And then when they brought her out of the coma, they put her on the unit, on the floor, in a private room. But the children on that floor were her age. And she woke up. And she realized that she couldn't feel anything. She couldn't move anything. She would look at her feet. Nothing was happening. And Julie became very angry. She was angry at her coach, at her trainer, because she was the best gymnast. And he should have taken her home. He shouldn't have sent her off to the bus stop. She was angry at her father. He could have picked her up that night. She was angry at the doctors and at the nurses. They can put a man on the moon, but they can't make me whole. She thought of herself as Humpty Dumpty. Fell off the wall, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put her back together again. Є дитячий вірш про яйце, що впало з плота і розбилося, і ніхто не міг сполучити в одне. But the worst anger, the most vicious words, she reserved for me. For in her eyes, I represented the God that allowed it to happen. She went to church. She prayed faithfully. She was a good child. And God let her down. Every day I would stop by her room and I would say, "Hi, Julie." And every day she would use words at me that I didn't know 13-year-olds knew. She swore up and down. She ranted, she raged, she screamed. If she could reach something, she would take it and whip it at me. It got to the point where the doctors and the nurses told me, "Don't go in there. You're just riling her up. You're not helping. Don't go in there." Every day, though, I would go in and, "Hi, Julie. Just wanted to let you know I'm here. I'm around." A couple of weeks went by and she was still in the hospital. It was the middle of the night. Beep, 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 beep. I looked at the pager and it was the floor where Julie was. It was her unit. I thought something wrong happened, something bad happened. So I phoned the hospital and they said, "She's asking for you. Come on in." And I did. I went in and it was middle of the night. Julie had a private room. They had the light on just above the bed, not the whole room. She was backlit. They had the bed cranked up. So she was sitting and crying. And when she saw me, she reached out. And I came and she gave me the biggest hug, the strongest hug I've had ever. And all she was repeating were the words, "He loves me. He loves me." And I looked at her and I go, "Julie, who are you talking? Everybody loves you." Her room was like a florist shop. Kwiaty, wszędzie. She had flowers from her school. She had flowers from her church. She had flowers from all the children in the neighborhood. She had flowers from her athletic club. She had flowers from strangers who read about it in the paper or heard about it on the news and sent her flowers to get better. And she kept hugging me and said, "He loves me. He loves me." And I kept trying to understand. Otec Diakon, with all the diplomas on the wall to show how smart he was, couldn't understand what a 13-year-old girl was telling him. And I said, "Julie, the doctors love you. The nurses love you. Your parents love you. All your friends love you." And she just kept repeating, "He loves me. He loves me." And at the end, when she calmed down, she told me what happened that night. Yesterday I was asked whether it gets any easier, whether the first death was the hardest, and does it get easier as you go along? And I said, no. It's even hard in the retelling. She said that night she was sleeping and something woke her up. And she woke up, she opened her eyes, and she saw a man dressed in white, standing by the bed and just looking at her. She thought it was a doctor, or maybe a male nurse came checking up on her. But as she kept waking up and her vision became clearer, she recognized the face. Jesus was standing beside her. To this day, she still doesn't know if it was a dream, if it was an apparition, payava, whether she was hallucinating because of the drugs she was still on. But she said he was standing there. And when she recognized who that was, she told me she wanted to hurt him as much as he hurt her. And she started to taunt him. And she said, "Jesus, do you love me? My priest says that you love me. How much do you love me? Do you love me this much?" He didn't answer. And she said, "Jesus, my mother says do you love me, that you love me. How much do you love me? Do you love me this much?" And then she got really angry. And she goes, "Christ! Do you even love me this much?" And at the end, just to hurt him even more, she spat in his direction. And she said, all he did was stand there and take it. When she was finished, when she was exhausted, he spoke. And he said, Julie, I don't love you this much. My dear child, I don't love you this much. Serce moje, I don't love you this much. But for you to know how much I love you in front of her eyes, he spread his hands as far as he could. He dropped his head. And he died. A 13-year-old girl experienced Christ's crucifixion on the cross. A 13-year-old girl understood that Christ's crucifixion on the cross was an expression of his love for her. I've seen people use the cross for many reasons. Some of them use them as decorations. I've seen earrings as crosses. Some people use the cross as a good luck charm. The way people keep Dracula away with garlic. They keep evil away with the cross by wearing it. Julie had to teach me. 13-year-old girl had to evangelize me, a deacon, as to the true meaning of the cross. It is not a sign of humiliation. It is not a sign of victory. The cross is the sign of God's love for each and every one of us. For you, and you, and you, and you back there, and you, i dla was, Twoja lubowy, i dla was, dla wszystkich nas. They discharged Julie from the hospital after a while, but that night a miracle happened. You might think that she got her walking feet back. No. Julie's still in the wheelchair today. But that night, her understanding of the cross and her accident and her paralysis changed. She no longer looked upon herself as Humpty Dumpty. In her eyes, she was whole. She was complete. When I asked Julie for permission to share her story, she said, on one condition, you tell them the whole story. And the whole story is that today, Julie has, up to today, or since that time, Julie has completed university. She studied sociology. And she works today with children who had an accident or an illness that changed their life. A couple of years back, she found someone. They were married. And I received special permission from the Bishop of London in Ontario to do the wedding at the request of Julie and her family. So the bishop gave me his blessing and I did the wedding for them. Julie today drives her own vehicle. I'm not sure, I think it was either the Rotary Club or one of the service clubs bought her a van that has hand control. And she drives like a bat out of hell. Her van is her freedom. I asked her, must be now, a while back. I go, Julie, if medicine gets to the point that they could fix the damage done to your spinal column, if they could make you walk, would you want that operation? I thought that was a no-brainer. I thought for sure. She said, yeah, I'd take it. She looked at me. And she said, no. She accepts her wheelchair the way Christ accepted his cross. And she's afraid that if she started walking, that night would lose its significance for her, would lose its meaning. To keep that night alive in her mind, she needs and she wants the wheelchair. We're talking about evangelization. That night, a beautiful child was evangelized by Christ. That night, an arrogant deacon who thought he knew it all was evangelized by a 13-year-old girl. My prayer and my hope is that we are open to the possibility of being evangelized by our parishioners, by our parish council, by the people we meet in the street, by the news that we hear or read in the paper. Every event has a potential evangelization moment where we come to know Christ in a deeper and more intimate way. That is what evangelization is all about. Чи є потреба щось пояснити, повторити по-українськи? Більшість не зрозуміли. То, що не зрозуміли, можете знаєте, в який напрям та думка йшла. And that's the story of Julie. Before the operation, she was exceptional. Before the accident, she was exceptional. After the accident, I believe she became blessed. C'est ça. C'est tout. Fini. Le tekst не зрозуміли, то все закінчилося. I will not be speaking for an hour. Ever. But hopefully these moments, although shorter, will be intense. It gives you something to think about. You have now an opportunity for an hour and a half. Are there any questions? Як маєте якісь запити, маєте право запитати їх. Як то закінчилося, чи щось пояснити. I encourage questions. That helps in our understanding. If there are no questions, I hesitate thinking Maybe they slept through the whole thing and they didn't hear it. Or maybe it was so confusing that they don't know where to begin asking questions. But please, at any time during this retreat, preferably not 2 o'clock in the morning, and preferably not standing at the door going beep, 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 beep. I still have nightmares about that sound. But this is what we're here for, to share, to deepen our relationship with God. Jak naman jakich zapytiu, I invite you now to spend the next time in reflection. Please be mindful that we're still asking for silence. So this is personal meditation time, personal reading. Macie duchowi naukę, kniżki, що взяв привезли з собою. Або тільки застановитися над Юлією, як би ви реагували. I always try to put myself in her place. How would I react if I was the one being hit by the car and whose life was changed so dramatically? I'm not sure if I would be so charitable as she was. Proszę wstać.